Hi everyone, I'm Casey Martin from Wine Country Mica Powder and Wine Country Woodworks, and this is going to be the start of a really awesome series for beginners in the resin casting and stabilizing world. This first video is going to be going over the tools needed to start resin casting, some of the different pros and cons between different ones, and basically just everything you need to get started. And this series was actually suggested by one of you, so definitely comment down below with any other suggestions once you're done watching this on tips or tricks you'd like me to cover in this series. But I don't know how many parts there will end up being in this, if it'll be a 3 or 4 part video series or a 5 or however many, but it will definitely cover everything that's needed in resin casting and stabilizing. So let's get started. All right, so one of the first things you of course need for resin casting is the resin itself. And this topic could probably even have its own video dedicated towards it, but I will just briefly go over the resin that I use, the different types of resins out there, and the different tools needed for the different types. The resin that I use, if you've ever watched any of my other videos, is Alumilite. I use Alumilite Clear. Alumilite is actually the name of a company, and they make a ton of different resins. So the Alumilite Clear that I use is a polyurethane resin. The other most popular type of resin is called an epoxy resin. And there's really two key differences between these when it comes to tools. The main thing being that if you're going to be using a polyurethane resin, especially Alumilite Clear or Alumilite Clear Slow, you're going to need a pressure pot. And the reason why you would need a pressure pot, which we'll get into later, is to get rid of bubbles so that it cures crystal clear. If you are going to be using epoxy, which Alumilite sells some, Total Boat sells some, Liquid Diamonds, there are tons and tons of companies out there that sell epoxy. Ecopoxy, you name it, right? There's thousands, if not hundreds at least, companies that sell epoxy resin. So you can definitely go look at those. But the main difference of why epoxy resins don't necessarily need a pressure pot is because they take a lot longer to cure. Some of them take anywhere from 10 to 15 hours to a whole day or 2 hours until it cures. And that amount of cure time allows all of the bubbles to rise to the surface of the resin and pop on their own. Whereas with polyurethane resins, especially like Alumilite Clear that I use, it cures in the matter of hours, like an hour or 2 hours, or a little longer if you're using their slow version. But point being, a huge contrast between a few hours versus potentially a few days, and so you need to use pressure in order to get those bubbles smaller. So as I said, the topic in of itself could probably have a whole video dedicated to it, and definitely comment down below if you guys would like that. I've done some comparison videos in the past, and I can definitely maybe do another comparison video kind of talking about the pros and cons between polyurethanes, epoxies, polyester resins, etc. But for the purpose of this video, I just wanted to briefly mention that topic and then kind of dive into more of some of the tools. So moving on to the second item, as I mentioned, if you're going to be using polyurethane resins, you'll need a pressure pot. I highly recommend, if you are a beginner, to go 2 routes. One route, if you are trying to stay on a really frugal budget, you can get a Harbor Freight pressure pot. They are about $100, and you can use a 20% off coupon, or maybe it's a $20 coupon, I forget, that you can just get online, and it comes out to be $80. At least that was the price of it last time I checked several years ago when I first got started, and that is probably about the same price as it is now, maybe a little different. But for the most part, really cheap, relatively speaking, to get a pressure pot from Harbor Freight. The other route you can go is to get a resin casting pot that's actually designed for the activity from either TCP Global or California Air Tools. I've done review videos on those, and so if you want to go check those out, you can. But they have 2.5 gallon, 5 gallon versions, and even 10 gallon versions, which, for a beginner, you can definitely get away, of course, with a 2.5 gallon tank if you're just going to be doing smaller castings. If you're going to be doing larger ones, then you'll probably want a 5-gallon anyway. And I think they're about a couple $100 or $250. So if I was to recommend to a beginner, I mean, it's really up to you. You can of course spend a little bit more and get a 5-gallon pressure pot. I think in the grand scheme of things, they're really reasonable. At the same time, if you're going to be doing small casting only, and especially not planning on doing larger casting in the future, a 2.5-gallon pressure pot from Harbor Freight is just fine. I have 2 of them that I got 6 years ago, and they're still going strong, right? And I use them all the time when I'm casting my smaller items like pen blanks or whatever. So definitely can go either way, whichever works the best for you. And of course, if you are going to be casting epoxies or other resins like that, then you can skip this tool entirely. It's not going to hurt anything by any means. You can absolutely use a pressure pot if you're using epoxy. It's only going to help if you are doing a bunch of epoxy castings and you notice you're getting bubbles in it. You can of course get a pressure pot, put those same castings into it, and then you'll get rid of those bubbles. The only caveat is if you have even a minuscule leak in your pressure pot and your epoxy resin takes a day or 2 to cure, well, you have to stay above 40-50 psi in that pressure pot for a lot longer time than just a couple hours with a polyurethane like Alumilite. So just something to keep in mind. So moving on to the other kind of more mundane but absolutely necessary items, you're going to want some gloves, right? And whether you use some kind of higher quality, more thick black gloves that chefs use and other people use that they keep on for extended time, or just some really thin disposable ones, it's really up to you. I use thin disposable ones because they get covered in different colored resins and dyes and stuff like that, and when I'm switching between castings, or especially doing a clear casting after something's dyed, I need to swap them out. So it's really particular to what you're doing. If you're doing epoxy pours, for instance, that are more of project pours where you're making a big table or a canvas or whatever, and you're going to be doing that specific pour for like an hour, then maybe the higher quality, longer lasting gloves make sense. So again, a little more dependent on what type of casting you're going to be using and the user, but definitely needed for sure. Another aspect that kind of falls into that category is cups. So I primarily use 16-ounce clear Solo cups. It doesn't necessarily need to be the brand Solo, but I almost always get 16-ounce clear cups. I use those for 90% of my castings because that is the largest size that I need on a day-to-day basis. And having clear mixing cups is super important for what I do, because with Alumilite, you need to mix really, really quickly, and most polyurethanes for that matter. And so you need to be able to look and see if there's any striations and any indication that the part A and part B aren't mixed. And so that's why I like the clear cups. If you're going to be doing larger pours, which are probably the case with like epoxy and stuff like that, then you're going to be wanting some larger mixing cups. And those are more of kind of like paint mixing cups. And you can get those from, just a local home store like Ace Hardware, Home Depot, or wherever. You can also, of course, get them online off of Amazon or Turner's Warehouse, other places like that. And those are really important to make sure, which almost all are, that they're HDPE plastic. That makes it so that if you want to reuse them, you can just pop off the cured resin after it's done and reuse those for another pour. So again, it's really dependent on what type of casting you're going to be doing, but those are kind of the things to consider. If you're going to be doing very small pours with a bunch of different colors, you can also get even smaller plastic cups, right? So you're not wasteful. Again, it's really dependent on what you're going to be doing. The last aspect kind of in that just kind of mundane but absolutely necessary category is mixing sticks. So I primarily use jumbo popsicle sticks because those work perfectly for the 16-ounce cups. They're really sturdy, but they're not oversized or unnecessarily oversized. And then the other items I use are just kind of normal paint mixing sticks when I'm using my larger mixing cups that I'm doing 40, 50, 60 ounce pours with. Those are what I like to use. A lot of people don't like to use disposable sticks, so they may use a silicone spatula or a silicone mixing stick. You can go find what works best for you. I primarily use the popsicle sticks and the disposable paint mixing sticks just because it works well for me, and I don't have the luxury of being able to wait around in between pours. I usually do 5 to 10, sometimes more pours in a single casting session over a few hours, where if I was using silicone mixing sticks, I'd have to get a bunch of them and wait for them to cure and then peel them off so I could reuse them. Nothing against them. They're great for people whose resin casting activities allow for them. In certain circumstances, they're awesome. So again, whatever works best for you, but definitely something that you'll need. Another item that I forgot to mention when I was talking about pressure pots, if you're using a polyurethane like Alumilite or most polyurethanes, that's different than if you're casting epoxies, and that is using a scale. Alumilite is mixed by weight. Almost all epoxies are mixed by volume, so you'll usually be using a mixing cup that has the volume lines on the side so that you can measure out exactly what the volume is. But for Alumilite, you're going to need a scale, right? If you're doing a 200 gram pour, you're going to need 100 grams of part A and 100 grams of part B, and in order to make sure that you're really close to that, you of course need a scale. And I have links in the video description to all the tools that I use, so you can check out the scale that I use in particular. But honestly, any scale that measures to a gram, or even better yet, the 1/10 of a gram, is gonna work just fine. If you're doing smaller pours with Alumilite or another polyurethane that mixes by weight, I highly encourage to get a scale that measures to the 1/10 of a gram. In that case, I think it's really important when you're doing smaller pours. If you're doing really large pours with Alumilite, you can get away with a couple grams being off or so. It's not gonna hinder the curing process, but again, something that's needed if you're going to be using a resin that's mixed by weight rather than volume. Now, the last aspect that's needed is molds. So this again could also probably be a video, or at least a short video on its own topic, so I won't try to belabor it too much, but there are primarily, in my opinion, two main types of mold material that are worth using. One is silicone and the other is HDPE, or high density polyethylene plastic. So if you've watched any of my videos or some of the other resin casters out there and you see white plastic molds, that's what HDPE is. You also see some people use melamine if you're seeing them do really large pours with epoxy for tables or coffee tables or whatever, and that can work too, but I would highly recommend using HDPE if you're trying to make a reusable mold, and especially something that needs to be really rigid. The other mold material that I would really highly recommend for beginning resin casters, and I would actually recommend over HDPE as a beginner, would be silicone. Silicone, if you're just trying to cast a certain shape or figurine or something like that, you can almost always find a really cool, very good mold off of Amazon or somewhere online. You can just Google butterfly silicone molds, for instance, and you'll get a silicone mold for a butterfly, or star silicone molds, or whatever shape item you want. You can probably find something for that. And demolding from silicone, whether it's a polyurethane like Alumilite or an epoxy, it's super easy. With HDPE, it's also really easy, but you'll probably want to use some mold release, which is also helpful for silicone too, and is another item I would recommend as a beginner. It's not absolutely necessary if you're using silicone, but it's only gonna help. So that's another item to keep on the list. So that is about it for this first video in this series. I tried to cover every single thing that I could think of that's really important for a beginner getting into resin casting, whether it's a polyurethane resin like Alumilite, which I use, or an epoxy like liquid diamonds or epoxy, or whatever the type of resin casting you're going to be doing. I really tried to make sure that I got every tool that is needed. If I missed out anything and you're an experienced resin caster or even a beginner resin caster and notice something that I missed out, please comment down below so anybody else watching this video can go check out the comment section and see if there's anything that is really important that I may have not mentioned. Also, just please comment down below what you guys thought about the video, if there's any tips or advice for resin casters that you also want to throw out there for beginners, and also some suggestions for other topics to cover in this new series. I'm really excited about this new series. I think this is going to help me a lot in achieving my New Year's resolution of making a YouTube video once a week for this channel. So I'm really excited to go through this series and provide a lot of value to you guys. So thank you all so much for watching. Please like the video if you liked it. It helps the YouTube algorithm a lot. Promote the channel and promote this topic to other resin casters and especially beginning resin casters who this may help. So please like the video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and want to be notified of my future videos. And if that's the case, you can hit the little notification bell next to the subscription button and you'll get notified whenever I post. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.